My name is Sarah Chen, and at 32, I thought I knew everything about family loyalty until the day I sat in that Riverside County courthouse watching my own sister Jessica smirk at me from across the aisle. She had just finished telling the judge why I deserved nothing from our grandfather's estate, painting me as an ungrateful granddaughter who had abandoned our family's legacy. What Jessica didn't know was that our grandfather Bob had been planning something for years. Something that would wipe that smug expression clean off her face. One secret clause buried deep in his will was about to turn her victory celebration into the most humiliating moment of her life, and when the judge read those words out loud, the entire courtroom would gasp in disbelief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story of how I ended up in that courthouse begins with the scent of fresh apple blossoms and the sound of my grandfather's gentle laughter echoing through the orchards of Chen family farms. Growing up in rural Riverside County, Ohio, I spent every summer at Grandpa Bob's 85-acre farm, where rows upon rows of apple and peach trees stretched as far as my young eyes could see. The farmhouse, a classic white colonial with its wraparound porch and creaking wooden floors, felt more like home to me than anywhere else in the world. Grandpa Bob wasn't just my grandfather. He was my hero, my mentor, and my closest friend, all rolled into one weathered frame. At 78, he still possessed the kind of strength that came from decades of working the land with his own hands. His calloused fingers could graft a tree branch with surgical precision, and his keen eyes could spot disease in an orchard from 50 yards away. But what I treasured most were the evenings we spent on that old porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky purple and orange while he shared stories about building the farm from nothing. Robert Chen had arrived in Ohio in 1962 with $37 in his pocket, a Purple Heart from Korea, and a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except himself. He had purchased the land when it was nothing but overgrown fields and rocky soil that previous owners had given up on. She attended Ohio State University, majoring in business administration with a focus on agricultural economics. During family gatherings, she would present elaborate PowerPoint presentations about how the farm could increase revenue by 20% through strategic partnerships with larger distributors or by converting portions of the orchard to more profitable crops. Grandpa Bob listened politely to these presentations, but I could see something in his eyes that Jessica missed. There was a sadness there, a recognition that his eldest granddaughter saw dollar signs, where he saw decades of careful cultivation and community relationships. The farm wasn't just a business to him, it was a testament to what immigrants could accomplish in America, a symbol of persistence and hope that he wanted to preserve for future generations. My own path diverged sharply from Jessica's when I chose to study environmental science at Miami University. The decision created the first real tension in our family, with Jessica openly questioning why I was pursuing what she called an impractical degree when I could be learning skills that would directly benefit the family business. My parents, caught between supporting my academic interests and understanding Jessica's practical concerns, tried to remain neutral, but clearly harbored doubts about my choices. Grandpa Bob, however, surprised everyone by being my strongest supporter. During one particularly heated family dinner where Jessica was lecturing me about wasting opportunities, he quietly stood up and asked me to join him for a walk through the orchards. As we strolled between the rows of apple trees, their branches heavy with late summer fruit, he shared something that changed my perspective entirely. He told me about the challenges facing modern agriculture, from climate change and soil depletion to the increasing demand for sustainable farming practices. He had been reading scientific journals and attending agricultural conferences, educating himself about these emerging issues, because he understood that the future of farming would require more than traditional business knowledge. What farms like ours needed, he explained, were people who understood both the science and the soul of agriculture, people who could bridge the gap between environmental responsibility and economic viability. That conversation revealed a side of Grandpa Bob that even I hadn't fully appreciated. Behind his folksy demeanor and old-fashioned work ethic was a man who was constantly learning and adapting, someone who understood that preserving the farm's legacy meant evolving with changing times, rather than clinging to outdated methods. He had been quietly implementing sustainable practices for years, from integrated pest management to water conservation techniques, because he recognized that short-term profits meant nothing if the land became unusable for future generations. After graduation, I accepted a position with the Ohio Department of Agriculture as an environmental compliance specialist, work that took me throughout the state, but allowed me to return to the farm regularly. These visits became even more precious as Grandpa Bob entered his 80s and began showing subtle signs of aging. His step was slightly slower, his hands sometimes trembled when he was tired, and he relied more heavily on the farm manager he had hired to handle the daily operations. During this period, Jessica's involvement with the farm increased dramatically. She had married Mark Williams, a successful real estate developer from the nearby town of Fairview, and together they had begun pressuring Grandpa Bob to consider what they called modernization opportunities. Their suggestions ranged from selling portions of the property for residential development to converting the farmhouse into a wedding venue to capitalize on the growing agritourism market. These conversations always made me uncomfortable, not because Jessica's ideas lacked merit, but because they fundamentally misunderstood what the farm meant to Grandpa Bob. He had spent 60 years building something that represented his values and his vision for how agriculture should be practiced. The idea of transforming it into a business that happened to operate on a farm rather than a farm that also functioned as a business represented a philosophical shift that went against everything he had worked to create. As Grandpa Bob's 80th birthday approached, family dynamics became increasingly strained. Jessica and Mark had moved into a large house on the adjacent property, ostensibly to be closer to Grandpa Bob as he aged, but their presence felt more like a takeover than support. They hired a housekeeper for him without consulting anyone else, replaced his longtime accountant with someone they trusted, and began making decisions about farm operations that had previously been his domain alone. The changes were subtle but significant. The longtime employees who had worked for Grandpa Bob for decades suddenly found themselves reporting to Jessica instead of directly to him. Decisions about which varieties to plant and when to harvest, choices that Grandpa Bob had always made based on his intimate knowledge of the land and climate, were now being influenced by market research and profit projections that Jessica presented during their weekly business meetings. I tried to raise my concerns during family gatherings, but my objections were dismissed as romantic nostalgia for a farming method that was no longer economically viable. Jessica would point to spreadsheets, showing how her modifications had increased efficiency and profitability, arguing that emotion had no place in business decisions. When I suggested that some traditions were worth preserving even if they weren't the most profitable options, she would roll her eyes and accuse me of being impractical and idealistic. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. Jessica announced that she and Mark had been working with a development company that was interested in purchasing the eastern 40 acres of the farm for a luxury housing development. The sale would generate enough income to completely modernize the remaining orchards and provide substantial retirement security for Grandpa Bob. She presented this as a done deal, something they had been negotiating for months without consulting anyone else. Grandpa Bob sat quietly through her presentation, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. When Jessica finished speaking, the dining room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, he looked up and said simply that he would need time to consider such a major decision. Over the following weeks, I noticed changes in Grandpa Bob that worried me. He seemed more withdrawn and contemplative, spending long hours alone in his workshop in the old barn, emerging only for meals and his evening walks through the orchards. When I asked if he wanted to talk about Jessica's proposal, he would change the subject. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Or suggest we focus on immediate concerns, like preparing the trees for winter. It was during one of these quiet periods that Grandpa Bob began sharing stories I had never heard before. Tales about the early years when he was building the farm, and the sacrifices he had made to create something lasting. He talked about the neighbors who had helped him during difficult seasons, the employees who had become like family, and the satisfaction of watching trees he had planted as saplings grow tall enough to shade his grandchildren. These conversations felt different from our usual exchanges, more urgent somehow, as if he was trying to convey important information that couldn't be communicated directly. He would point out subtle details about the farm that I had never noticed, explaining the reasoning behind decisions he had made decades earlier, and the long-term consequences of choices that had seemed minor at the time. One evening in early December, as we sat on the porch despite the cold watching the bare branches of the apple trees silhouetted against the winter sky, Grandpa Bob told me something that I didn't fully understand until much later. He said that he had been making preparations to ensure that the farm would continue to serve its intended purpose long after he was gone, regardless of what others might want to do with it. When I asked what kind of preparations he meant, he smiled and patted my hand, saying that I would understand everything when the time came. He made me promise that no matter what happened, no matter how difficult things became, I would remember that some fights were worth having, because they were about more than money or convenience. They were about preserving something valuable for people who would never have the chance to thank us for our sacrifice. That conversation took place on a Thursday evening. The following Tuesday, Grandpa Bob suffered a massive heart attack while checking on the apple trees in the north orchard. The farm manager found him an hour later, peaceful and still, his hand resting on the trunk of one of the original trees he had planted 60 years earlier. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning in December at the small Methodist church where Grandpa Bob had worshipped for over 40 years. The service was standing room only, filled with farmers, suppliers, employees, and community members whose lives had been touched by his generosity and integrity. Person after person shared stories about his kindness, his business ethics, and his quiet contributions to local charities and causes. Throughout the service, Jessica played the role of grieving granddaughter perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity. But I noticed that during the graveside ceremony, while the minister was speaking about Grandpa Bob's legacy and the importance of continuing his work, Jessica was whispering with Mark about logistics and timing. Their conversation clearly focused on practical matters rather than mourning our loss. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at the law office of Martin Brewster, the elderly attorney who had handled Grandpa Bob's legal affairs for over 20 years. The brick building on Main Street had probably looked exactly the same in 1962 when Grandpa Bob first walked through its doors. And sitting in the wood-paneled conference room surrounded by legal books and faded photographs of Millbrook's founding families, I felt the weight of history and tradition that Jessica seemed so eager to abandon. Martin Brewster was a man in his 70s with thick white hair and the kind of careful, measured speech that comes from decades of delivering news that changes lives forever. Before opening the will, he explained that Grandpa Bob had been very specific about how and when certain information should be revealed, and that we should allow him to read the document completely before asking questions or making comments. The will began with standard provisions, leaving personal items and small monetary gifts to various friends and employees. Grandpa Bob's antique tools went to the farm manager who had worked beside him for 15 years. His collection of agricultural books went to the local library. His watch, a simple Timex that had somehow survived both Korea and 60 years of farm work, was left to our cousin Tyler, Uncle David's son who had always admired it. Then came the section that would determine the future of Chen family orchards. Jessica sat forward in her chair, her legal pad ready to take notes, clearly expecting to hear that the farm would be divided equally among the surviving family members. Mark reached over and squeezed her hand, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained anticipation. Martin Brewster cleared his throat and began reading the section that would change everything. To my beloved granddaughter Sarah Chen, who alone among my descendants has shown genuine understanding of what this farm represents, and dedication to the principles upon which it was built, I leave the entirety of Chen family orchards, including all real property, equipment, livestock, growing crops, and related business interests. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Jessica's pen clattered to the table, and Mark's mouth fell open in shock. Uncle David and Aunt Linda exchanged glances of disbelief. I felt as though someone had knocked the air from my lungs, not just because of the unexpected inheritance, but because of the magnitude of responsibility that had just been placed on my shoulders. But Martin Brewster wasn't finished reading. The will continued with specific provisions for other family members, including substantial financial bequests that would provide security without giving them control over the farm's operations. Jessica was to receive $200,000 and several pieces of valuable jewelry that had belonged to our grandmother. Uncle David and his family were provided for with generous gifts and the guarantee of continued employment if they chose to remain involved with the farm. However, these provisions came with conditions. The money would be held in trust and distributed annually, contingent upon the recipients not interfering with the farm's operations or attempting to pressure Sarah into making changes that violated the core principles outlined in an attached document that detailed Grandpa Bob's vision for sustainable agriculture and community responsibility. Jessica found her voice first, her shock quickly transforming into indignation. "This is impossible," she declared, standing so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "Sarah has no experience running a business this size. She doesn't understand the financial complexities or the market pressures." Grandpa Bob was clearly not thinking clearly when he made these decisions. Martin Brewster remained calm, having undoubtedly witnessed similar reactions countless times throughout his career. He explained that the will had been updated just 6 months earlier, following extensive consultations between himself and Grandpa Bob, including assessments by independent medical professionals who had certified his mental competency. Mark leaned forward, his real estate developer instincts kicking in as he began calculating the financial implications. "The farm's value had to be approaching $2 million, he said, his voice tight with poorly concealed anger. "This kind of decision affects the entire family's financial security. There has to be some way to contest this. Some legal avenue for ensuring a more equitable distribution." That's when Martin Brewster delivered the information that would ultimately lead us all to that courthouse confrontation. He explained that while the family certainly had the right to contest the will, they should be aware that Grandpa Bob had anticipated this possibility and had included specific provisions to address any challenges to his final wishes. These provisions, he said, reaching for a sealed envelope that had been paper-clipped to the back of the will, were not to be revealed unless and until a formal contest was filed. However, he was authorized to inform us that Grandpa Bob had spent considerable time and resources over the past several years documenting his reasons for these decisions, and that any legal challenge would result in the disclosure of information that might be uncomfortable for certain family members. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jessica and Mark exchanged glances that suggested they were trying to determine what Grandpa Bob might have known about their activities or intentions. Uncle David looked confused, clearly wondering what secrets his father might have been keeping. In the tense silence that followed, I spoke for the first time since the reading had begun. I told them that I had never expected or asked for this inheritance, that I was as surprised as anyone by Grandpa Bob's decision. I suggested that we take time to process what we had heard and find a way to move forward that honored his memory while addressing everyone's concerns. But Jessica was beyond reasoning. Her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She declared that she would not allow our family's legacy to be destroyed by someone who had never shown any real commitment to the farm's success. She and Mark stormed out of the office, but not before she turned in the doorway and delivered the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. "You may have fooled Grandpa Bob with your environmental science degree and your weekend visits," she said, her voice trembling with rage, "but you'll never be able to handle what you've inherited. When you fail, and you will fail, don't expect any help from us. You'll get nothing from this family, except the consequences of your own incompetence." Those words would prove to be ironically prophetic, though not in the way Jessica intended. The weeks following the will reading felt like living in a pressure cooker that was slowly building toward an inevitable explosion. Jessica wasted no time in making good on her threat to challenge Grandpa Bob's final wishes, and the speed with which she mobilized her attack caught me completely off guard. Within 72 hours of storming out of Martin Brewster's office, she had retained the services of Hammond, Sterling & Associates, one of Columbus's most prestigious law firms known for their aggressive tactics in high-stakes estate disputes. The first indication that Jessica was serious about waging legal warfare came in the form of a certified letter delivered to my apartment in Columbus on a Wednesday morning. The thick envelope contained a formal notice of intent to contest the will, along with a preliminary injunction that effectively froze all assets related to Chen family orchards pending the outcome of legal proceedings. The injunction meant that I couldn't make any significant decisions about the farm's operations, couldn't access the business accounts, and couldn't even live in the farmhouse until the matter was resolved. Reading through the legal documents, I was stunned by the scope and sophistication of Jessica's challenge. Her attorneys had clearly done their homework, crafting arguments that painted Grandpa Bob as a man whose judgment had been compromised by advancing age and my supposed manipulation. They claimed that I had taken advantage of my position as his favorite granddaughter to poison his mind against other family members, systematically isolating him from Jessica and Mark's sound business advice, while filling his head with impractical environmental theories that clouded his decision-making. The petition alleged that Grandpa Bob's mental faculties had been declining for years, citing instances where he had repeated stories or forgotten minor details as evidence of cognitive impairment. They argued that a man in his right mind would never have left a multi-million-dollar agricultural operation to someone with no business experience, especially when more qualified family members were available to continue his legacy responsibly. Most disturbing was how they had twisted my relationship with Grandpa Bob into something calculated and mercenary. According to their narrative, my frequent visits to the farm weren't expressions of genuine affection but strategic moves designed to position myself as the sole heir. My environmental science background wasn't portrayed as relevant expertise, but as evidence that I was more interested in pursuing trendy ecological fads than maintaining the profitable operation that Grandpa Bob had spent decades building. The legal assault was accompanied by a public relations campaign that made my life in the small farming community increasingly uncomfortable. Jessica had always been more socially connected than me, with relationships throughout Riverside County that she had cultivated during her years of involvement with the farm's business operations. She used these connections skillfully, spreading carefully crafted versions of events that portrayed her as the victim of a family tragedy caused by my greed and manipulation. At the local diner where farmers gathered for coffee every morning, conversations would stop when I entered. People who had known me since childhood now looked at me with suspicion and disappointment, clearly believing that I had somehow cheated Jessica out of her rightful inheritance. The pharmacist who had filled Grandpa Bob's prescriptions made pointed comments about how sad it was when family members took advantage of elderly relatives. Even the mailman started delivering my letters with a coldness that hadn't existed before the will contest became public knowledge. Jessica's campaign was particularly effective because it tapped into existing prejudices about my career choices and lifestyle. Many people in the farming community had never understood why I had pursued environmental science instead of agricultural business, and Jessica's narrative gave them a framework for interpreting my education as evidence of impracticality and disloyalty to traditional farming values. The fact that I lived in Columbus rather than staying in Millbrook was presented as proof that I had never been truly committed to the family farm. The social isolation was compounded by practical difficulties that made it nearly impossible for me to mount an effective defense. Finding legal representation in a small county where Jessica had extensive connections proved challenging, as several attorneys either declined to take my case or quoted fees that seemed designed to discourage me from proceeding. The few lawyers who were willing to represent me lacked experience with complex estate disputes and seemed intimidated by the reputation and resources of Hammond, Sterling, and Associates. Meanwhile, the injunction was slowly strangling the farm's operations. The seasonal workers who had been scheduled to begin spring pruning were sent home because no one had legal authority to authorize their paychecks. Equipment that needed maintenance sat idle because repair expenditures required approval that couldn't be obtained. Most critically, the decisions about which varieties to plant and when to begin the season's cultivation had to be postponed indefinitely, potentially jeopardizing the entire year's harvest. Frank Morrison, the farm manager who had worked closely with Grandpa Bob for 15 years, called me regularly with updates that grew increasingly desperate. The uncertainty was affecting employee morale, and several longtime workers had begun looking for other positions rather than waiting for the legal dispute to be resolved. Frank himself was caught in an impossible situation, torn between his loyalty to Grandpa Bob's memory and the practical reality that Jessica and Mark were the only family members with immediate access to the resources needed to keep the operation running. The financial pressure was exacerbated by the fact that my job with the Ohio Department of Agriculture, while meaningful, didn't provide the kind of income needed to support a prolonged legal battle against well-funded opponents. Jessica and Mark's real estate development business was thriving, giving them access to significant liquid capital that they could deploy in their legal campaign. They retained expert witnesses, commissioned independent appraisals, and hired private investigators to examine every aspect of my relationship with Grandpa Bob. As spring turned to summer, the psychological toll of the constant attacks began affecting every aspect of my life. My work performance suffered as I found myself distracted by legal meetings and strategy sessions with my attorney. My few remaining friendships became strained as people grew tired of hearing about the family drama that seemed to dominate every conversation. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake at night, wondering whether I was fighting for something I truly deserved, or whether Jessica might be right about my lack of qualifications to manage such a complex operation. The turning point came during a particularly brutal deposition, where Jessica's attorneys spent 8 hours grilling me about every conversation I had ever had with Grandpa Bob, every decision I had influenced, and every moment when I might have taken advantage of his trust. They had clearly prepared for months, armed with detailed questions about incidents I had forgotten, and interpretations of events that made my innocent actions seem manipulative and calculated. One line of questioning focused on a weekend 3 years earlier, when I had encouraged Grandpa Bob to decline Jessica's suggestion that he sell a portion of the orchard to a developer who was offering above-market prices. The attorneys presented this as evidence that I had interfered with sound business decisions to further my own interests, conveniently ignoring the fact that Grandpa Bob had made similar decisions independently throughout his life, based on his commitment to preserving the farm's integrity. Another devastating series of questions centered on my environmental science degree and how I had supposedly used technical jargon and scientific concepts to confuse and manipulate an elderly man who lacked the educational background to evaluate my claims. They painted my discussions about sustainable agriculture as a deliberate campaign to undermine his confidence in traditional farming methods and make him dependent on my expertise. The most painful part of the deposition involved questions about Grandpa Bob's final months, when his energy had been declining and he had relied more heavily on others for help with daily tasks. Jessica's attorneys suggested that I had used this period of vulnerability to exert undue influence over his estate planning decisions, timing my visits to coincide with his meetings with Martin Brewster, and monopolizing his attention when he was most susceptible to suggestion. By the time the deposition ended, I felt completely drained and demoralized. The attorneys had taken every cherished memory of my relationship with Grandpa Bob and twisted it into evidence of manipulation and greed. Even moments that I remembered as examples of his wisdom and foresight had been reframed as instances where I had taken advantage of his declining faculties. Walking out of the law office that evening, I seriously considered accepting Jessica's latest settlement offer, which would have given me a modest inheritance while allowing her to take control of the farm's operations. The offer included a face-saving narrative about wanting to avoid further family discord and a promise that I would always be welcome to visit the farm and maintain my connection to Grandpa Bob's memory. But that night, sitting in my apartment surrounded by boxes of legal documents and financial records, I found myself thinking about the last conversation I had shared with Grandpa Bob on his porch. He had made me promise to remember that some fights were worth having because they were about more than personal gain or convenience. They were about preserving something valuable for people who would never have the chance to thank us for our sacrifice. The next morning, I called Martin Brewster and asked him a question that had been nagging at me for months. I asked him about the sealed envelope that he had mentioned during the will reading, the one containing information that Grandpa Bob had prepared in case his decisions were challenged. Martin's voice became very serious as he explained that opening that envelope would escalate the conflict dramatically and might reveal information that would permanently damage family relationships. When I pressed him for more details, Martin said that Grandpa Bob had been more aware of family dynamics and individual motivations than anyone had realized. Over the past several years, he had quietly documented various incidents and conversations that painted a very different picture of Jessica's involvement with the farm than the one she was presenting in court. However, using this information would essentially declare war on my own family and might have consequences that extended far beyond the current legal dispute. I spent the weekend walking through Millbrook's quiet streets thinking about the choice I was facing. I could accept Jessica's settlement offer and try to rebuild my life without the farm, preserving what remained of our family relationships while acknowledging that I wasn't qualified to manage such a complex inheritance. Or I could authorize Martin to open Grandpa Bob's sealed envelope and discover what ammunition he had prepared for this exact situation. The decision crystallized on Sunday evening when I received a phone call from Frank Morrison that changed everything. He told me that Jessica and Mark had begun making unauthorized changes to the farm's operations, bringing in their own management consultants and preparing to sign contracts with new distributors, without waiting for the legal dispute to be resolved. Even more concerning, they had been meeting with the same development company that had approached them 2 years earlier, apparently reviving discussions about selling portions of the property for residential construction. Frank's voice was heavy with disappointment and concern as he described watching strangers walk through the orchards with surveying equipment, marking trees for potential removal, and discussing how much of the land could be converted to other uses while maintaining the appearance of agricultural operation. The farm that Grandpa Bob had spent 60 years building was being evaluated not for its potential as a sustainable agricultural operation, but for its value as a commodity that could be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. That phone call made me realize that this fight wasn't really about my qualifications or my relationship with Grandpa Bob. It was about two fundamentally different visions for what the farm represented and what it should become. Jessica saw it as a business asset that should be optimized for maximum financial return, even if that meant abandoning the principles and practices that had made it successful. I saw it as a living legacy that should be preserved and enhanced for future generations, even if that meant accepting lower short-term profits in exchange for long-term sustainability. Monday morning, I called Martin Brewster and told him to open the envelope. Whatever Grandpa Bob had documented about Jessica's motivations and actions, I needed to know what kind of ammunition I had for the battle that was clearly going to determine not just who inherited the farm, but what kind of operation it would become. Martin scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon, giving me several days to steel myself for whatever revelations awaited. He warned me again that the information in the envelope was sensitive and potentially explosive, and that once we opened it, there would be no going back to the possibility of a peaceful family reconciliation. On Thursday, I arrived at Martin's office to find him looking more serious than I had ever seen him. The sealed envelope sat on his desk like a loaded weapon, and his hands trembled slightly as he carefully opened it and began reading through the contents. After several minutes of silent review, he looked up at me with an expression that mixed sadness, surprise, and something that might have been admiration for Grandpa Bob's thoroughness. The envelope contained 3 categories of documentation that painted a devastating picture of Jessica's true relationship with the farm and her motivations for challenging the will. The first category consisted of financial records showing that Jessica and Mark had been systematically borrowing money from the farm's accounts for their real estate ventures, using their access to the business finances to fund projects that had nothing to do with agricultural operations. The loans, which totaled nearly $400,000 over 3 years, had been structured to avoid detection during routine audits but represented a clear breach of fiduciary responsibility. Even more damaging was evidence that Jessica had been inflating invoices from suppliers and contractors, skimming the difference to support her lifestyle while making the farm appear less profitable than it actually was. The second category of evidence documented conversations and meetings where Jessica had explicitly discussed her plans to convert the farm to more profitable uses once she gained control of the inheritance. Grandpa Bob had apparently been recording these discussions without Jessica's knowledge, using a small digital device that captured her describing the orchard as a waste of valuable real estate that could generate much higher returns through residential development. In one particularly damning recording, Jessica could be heard telling Mark that she planned to maintain just enough agricultural activity to qualify for tax benefits while selling off the majority of the property to developers. She described Grandpa Bob's commitment to sustainable farming as sentimental nonsense that was preventing the family from capitalizing on the land's true value. The third and most shocking category of evidence revealed that Jessica had been in contact with a competing farm operation that was interested in acquiring Chen family orchards' customer contracts and distribution relationships. She had apparently been providing confidential business information to potential buyers, essentially conducting preliminary negotiations to sell the farm's most valuable assets even before Grandpa Bob's death. These documents included email exchanges where Jessica discussed which employees would be retained after a sale and which aspects of the operation would be discontinued to eliminate competition with the acquiring company. She had even provided detailed financial projections showing how much more profitable the land would be under different ownership and management. As Martin finished explaining the contents of the envelope, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of Jessica's betrayal. This wasn't just a disagreement about inheritance or management philosophy. She had been actively undermining the farm's operations while positioning herself to profit from its dismantling, all while Grandpa Bob was trusting her with increased responsibility for the business he had spent his lifetime building. The evidence explained so much about the family dynamics that had puzzled me in recent years. Jessica's sudden interest in modernizing the farm hadn't been motivated by a desire to honor Grandpa Bob's legacy, but by her need to maximize short-term profits to cover the money she had been stealing. Her criticism of my environmental focus wasn't based on sound business principles, but on her fear that sustainable practices would interfere with her plans to convert the property to more profitable uses. Martin explained that this evidence would be devastating in court, completely undermining Jessica's claims about acting in the family's best interests and her accusations about my supposed manipulation of Grandpa Bob. However, he emphasized that using this information would essentially destroy any possibility of future family relationships and might expose Jessica to criminal charges for theft and fraud. I asked Martin how long he had known about this evidence, and he explained that Grandpa Bob had been documenting Jessica's activities for over 2 years, apparently suspecting that her increased involvement with the farm was motivated by factors other than genuine concern for its welfare. He had hired a private investigator to verify his suspicions and had been working with a forensic accountant to trace the missing funds. The revelation that Grandpa Bob had been aware of Jessica's schemes while continuing to treat her with kindness and respect made his final decision even more poignant. He hadn't cut her out of his will because of anger or favoritism, but because he understood that giving her control of the farm would result in the destruction of everything he had worked to create. Martin also revealed that the will contained additional provisions that wouldn't be activated unless Jessica's challenge proceeded to trial. These provisions included detailed instructions for exposing her financial crimes and ensuring that she would be held accountable for the money she had stolen. Grandpa Bob had essentially set a trap that would spring shut if Jessica pushed too hard in her efforts to overturn his final wishes. As I walked out of Martin's office that Thursday evening, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination that would sustain me through the brutal months ahead. I was sad that my family relationships had deteriorated to this point, that Jessica's greed had corrupted her so completely, and that Grandpa Bob had spent his final years knowing that his own granddaughter was betraying his trust. But I was also determined to honor his memory by fighting for the principles he had tried to preserve. The farm represented more than just an inheritance or a business opportunity. It was a testament to the possibility of building something meaningful that could benefit multiple generations, and Jessica's plans would have reduced it to just another real estate transaction. The next phase of the legal battle would test everything I had learned about perseverance, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. But now I had the weapons Grandpa Bob had prepared for this exact moment, and I was ready to use them. Armed with Grandpa Bob's explosive evidence, I felt a surge of confidence that lasted exactly until I met Jessica's new legal team in court for the first preliminary hearing. Hammond, Sterling & Associates had brought in reinforcements from their corporate litigation division, transforming what should have been a straightforward estate dispute into something resembling a major commercial lawsuit. The lead attorney, Victoria Hammond herself, was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made judges listen when she spoke. Hammond had clearly studied every detail of my background, my relationship with Grandpa Bob, and my qualifications to manage a complex agricultural operation. During her opening remarks to Judge Patricia Kellerman, she painted a picture of me as a well-meaning but naive young woman who had been manipulated by environmental activists into believing that traditional farming methods were somehow harmful or outdated. According to Hammond's narrative, I had spent years filling Grandpa Bob's head with radical ecological theories that conflicted with the sound business practices that had made Chen family orchards profitable for 6 decades. She argued that my influence had caused him to make increasingly irrational decisions in his final years, culminating in a will that prioritized ideological purity over economic viability and family harmony. The sophistication of her argument was genuinely intimidating. Hammond didn't simply attack my character or qualifications. She systematically deconstructed the entire premise that environmental sustainability and agricultural profitability could coexist. She brought in expert witnesses who testified that organic farming methods would reduce crop yields by at least 30% while increasing labor costs and regulatory compliance expenses exponentially. Her star witness was Dr. Marcus Thompson, a retired professor of agricultural economics from Ohio State University, who had written extensively about the economic challenges facing small family farms in competitive markets. Thompson testified that operations like Chen family orchards could only survive by maximizing efficiency and minimizing costs, which meant embracing modern farming techniques and avoiding the expensive complications associated with environmental certification programs. Thompson's testimony was particularly damaging because he acknowledged that environmental concerns were legitimate, while arguing that they were luxury considerations that only large corporate farms could afford to address. Small operations like ours, he claimed, had to focus on immediate profitability or risk being driven out of business by larger competitors who could absorb the costs of sustainable practices. Hammond also brought in a business valuation expert who testified that the farm's current management structure was preventing it from reaching its full economic potential. According to his analysis, the property could generate 40% higher annual revenues through strategic partnerships with food processing companies and aggressive expansion into premium market segments that prioritized consistency and volume over environmental considerations. The psychological impact of these presentations was devastating, not because they were necessarily accurate, but because they sounded so reasonable and well-researched. Even I found myself wondering whether my commitment to sustainable farming was based more on idealistic theories than practical business sense. If respected experts believed that environmental practices would bankrupt the farm, perhaps Jessica's focus on maximizing profitability was the more responsible approach. Hammond's masterstroke was bringing in character witnesses who testified about my supposed pattern of impractical decision-making and poor judgment in personal relationships. My college roommate, whom I hadn't spoken to in over 5 years, somehow appeared to testify that I had always been prone to embracing trendy causes without considering their long-term consequences. Even more damaging was testimony from my former supervisor at the Ohio Department of Agriculture, who described me as dedicated but overly rigid in my interpretation of environmental regulations. He claimed that I had sometimes prioritized ecological concerns over practical considerations in ways that created unnecessary hardships for farmers who were trying to comply with government requirements. These witnesses weren't lying exactly, but they were presenting carefully selected aspects of my personality and professional history in ways that supported Hammond's narrative about my unsuitability for managing a complex business operation. The cumulative effect was to create an impression that I was a person who meant well but lacked the flexibility and practical wisdom necessary for successful agricultural management. Jessica herself was Hammond's most effective witness, delivering a performance that was simultaneously heartbreaking and infuriating. She testified about her deep love for Grandpa Bob and her concern about his increasing isolation in his final years, when he had seemed to rely more heavily on my advice while becoming less receptive to input from other family members. According to Jessica's testimony, she had tried repeatedly to maintain close relationships with Grandpa Bob, but had been gradually shut out as I gained more influence over his daily routine and decision-making processes. She described specific instances where she had offered to help with business decisions or farm management tasks, only to be told that I was already handling those responsibilities. Jessica's description of our family dynamics was skillfully crafted to make my close relationship with Grandpa Bob seem possessive and manipulative, rather than genuinely affectionate. She testified that I had discouraged him from seeking input from other family members by suggesting that they didn't understand modern agricultural challenges the way I did with my environmental science background. The most painful part of her testimony involved her description of Grandpa Bob's final months, when she claimed that his increasing dependence on my advice had isolated him from longtime friends and business associates who might have provided different perspectives on important decisions. She suggested that I had become a filter through which all information reached him, allowing me to shape his understanding of situations in ways that served my own interests. Mark's testimony was more focused on financial and business considerations, but equally damaging in its implications about my qualifications and motivations. He described his attempts to help Grandpa Bob modernize the farm's operations and improve its profitability, efforts that had allegedly been undermined by my insistence on implementing expensive environmental programs that provided minimal economic benefits. According to Mark's version of events, I had convinced Grandpa Bob to reject profitable business opportunities by exaggerating environmental concerns and promoting alternative approaches that sounded scientifically sophisticated but were economically impractical. He cited specific examples of potential partnerships and expansion opportunities that had been declined based on what he characterized as my ideological objections to conventional farming methods. Mark also testified about the financial implications of my inheritance, arguing that placing such valuable assets under the control of someone with no business experience was essentially gambling with the economic security of multiple family members. He painted a picture of himself and Jessica as responsible adults who had been unfairly excluded from their rightful inheritance by my manipulation of an elderly relative. The cumulative impact of these testimonies was overwhelming, creating a narrative that portrayed Jessica and Mark as victims of my scheming, rather than greedy relatives trying to steal an inheritance they hadn't earned. By the time Hammond finished presenting her case, even I was beginning to doubt whether I deserved the responsibility Grandpa Bob had given me. My attorney, David Weaver, was competent, but clearly outmatched by Hammond's resources and experience. Weaver had been practicing law in Riverside County for over 20 years, handling routine estate matters and business disputes, but he had never faced opposition like Hammond, Sterling, and Associates. His cross-examinations were thorough, but lacked the devastating precision that Hammond had demonstrated. Weaver's attempts to challenge the expert testimony about sustainable farming were hampered by his limited knowledge of agricultural science and economics. When he questioned Dr. Thompson about the long-term benefits of environmental stewardship, Thompson easily deflected his arguments by citing studies that supported conventional farming methods and pointing out the financial risks associated with transitioning to organic certification programs. Similarly, Weaver's efforts to expose the bias in Jessica's character witnesses were only partially successful. While he was able to establish that some of these people had limited recent contact with me, he couldn't effectively challenge their observations about my personality and decision-making style, because those observations contained enough truth to seem credible. The lowest point came during my own testimony, when Hammond's cross-examination exposed every doubt and insecurity I had ever felt about my qualifications to manage the farm. She began by establishing that I had never taken business courses, never managed employees, never been responsible for meeting payroll or managing cash flow, and never dealt with the complex regulatory requirements that governed agricultural operations. Hammond then walked me through a series of hypothetical scenarios involving crop failures, market fluctuations, labor disputes, and equipment breakdowns, systematically demonstrating that I had no experience with the kinds of crises that could bankrupt a farming operation overnight. Her questions were designed to show that my environmental science background, while valuable in some contexts, had not prepared me for the practical realities of running a business. The most devastating moment came when Hammond asked me to explain exactly how I planned to implement sustainable farming practices while maintaining the farm's profitability and meeting the financial obligations that came with my inheritance. My answer, which had seemed reasonable when I practiced it with Weaver, sounded naive and unrealistic when delivered under Hammond's relentless questioning. I found myself falling back on generalizations about the long-term benefits of environmental stewardship, without being able to provide specific financial projections or implementation timelines. Hammond skillfully exploited these gaps in my knowledge, making it clear that I was operating more on faith than expertise when it came to the business aspects of sustainable agriculture. By the time Hammond finished her cross-examination, I felt completely demoralized and exposed. She had succeeded in making me appear exactly as Jessica had described, a well-meaning but impractical idealist who had convinced an elderly man to entrust his life's work to someone fundamentally unqualified to preserve it. Judge Kellerman's questions during the hearing suggested that she was genuinely concerned about the wisdom of allowing me to inherit such a complex operation without adequate business experience or financial backing. Her inquiry into my plans for managing the farm's debt obligations and maintaining its competitive position in challenging agricultural markets revealed the depth of responsibility I would be assuming. The hearing concluded with Hammond requesting an expedited trial date, arguing that every day of continued uncertainty was damaging the farm's operations and threatening the livelihoods of its employees. She also filed a motion for expanded injunctive relief that would have prevented me from making any decisions about the farm's management even if the will were ultimately upheld. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt like I had been thoroughly defeated before the real battle had even begun. Hammond had expertly exploited every weakness in my position, while making Jessica appear like a responsible family member, trying to prevent a tragic mistake that would destroy everything Grandpa Bob had built. That evening, I called Frank Morrison to get his perspective on how the legal proceedings might affect the farm's daily operations. Frank's voice was heavy with concern as he described the impact that months of uncertainty were having on employee morale and business relationships. Several longtime workers had already left for more stable positions, and key customers were beginning to ask questions about the farm's ability to fulfill its contractual obligations. Frank also shared disturbing information about Jessica and Mark's activities during the legal proceedings. Despite the injunction that was supposed to prevent major changes to the farm's operations, they had been meeting regularly with potential buyers and investors, apparently laying the groundwork for a quick sale if they succeeded in overturning the will. Even more troubling, Frank had overheard conversations suggesting that Jessica and Mark were already making plans to liquidate portions of the farm's assets, regardless of the legal outcome. They seemed confident that even if I ultimately prevailed in court, the financial pressure of defending the lawsuit would force me to accept a settlement that would give them significant control over the operation's future direction. The next few weeks brought a series of legal maneuvers designed to increase pressure on me to settle before the case reached trial. Hammond filed motions challenging every aspect of the will's validity, from Grandpa Bob's mental competency to the proper execution of legal documents. Each motion required expensive responses from my attorney and created additional opportunities for Hammond to present evidence supporting Jessica's claims. Hammond also initiated discovery proceedings that gave her team access to extensive documentation about my relationship with Grandpa Bob, my financial situation, and my communications with anyone involved in the farm's operations. The discovery process was clearly designed to be as invasive and expensive as possible, forcing me to spend time and money defending against fishing expeditions while Jessica's team searched for additional ammunition. The psychological warfare was just as intense as the legal maneuvering. Anonymous letters began arriving at my apartment, suggesting that I should accept Jessica's settlement offers before the family's dirty laundry was aired in public. Phone calls at odd hours disrupted my sleep, and my car was vandalized twice in my apartment complex's parking lot. More subtly, I began noticing that people in Millbrook were treating me differently when I visited the area for legal meetings or to check on the farm. Conversations would stop when I entered local businesses, and longtime family friends seemed uncomfortable when they encountered me in public. Jessica's public relations campaign was clearly working, painting me as the villain in a family tragedy that was tearing apart a beloved local institution. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable. My savings were being depleted by legal fees, and my job performance was suffering as I spent more time dealing with lawsuit-related issues. David Weaver estimated that if the case went to trial, my total legal costs could exceed $200,000, money I simply didn't have. Jessica, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving under the spotlight. Local newspapers ran sympathetic profiles describing her as a devoted granddaughter fighting to preserve her family's agricultural legacy from misguided environmental extremism. She gave interviews explaining her vision for modernizing the farm while respecting its traditions, carefully avoiding any mention of her plans to sell portions of the property for development. The breaking point came when Hammond filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the evidence was so overwhelmingly in Jessica's favor that a trial was unnecessary. The motion included affidavits from additional expert witnesses and character references, along with a devastating financial analysis showing that my inheritance of the farm would likely result in its bankruptcy within 5 years. Reading through Hammond's motion, I realized that I was facing a level of legal and financial firepower that I could never match with conventional tactics. Even if I somehow managed to survive until trial, the costs would be ruinous, and Hammond's systematic destruction of my credibility made it unlikely that any judge would rule in my favor. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by boxes of legal documents and financial records, trying to decide whether to accept Jessica's latest settlement offer or continue fighting a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless. The offer had grown more generous as Hammond's confidence increased, now including enough money to pay my legal bills and start over somewhere else, plus a promise that I could maintain sentimental connections to the farm without any business responsibilities. But as I considered surrendering, I found myself thinking about the sealed evidence that Martin Brewster had shown me months earlier. Grandpa Bob's documentation of Jessica's crimes was devastating, but using it would essentially declare nuclear war on my own family and might result in criminal charges that would destroy more than just our lawsuit. The decision was made for me the next morning, when Frank Morrison called with news that changed everything. He had discovered that Jessica and Mark had been conducting unauthorized negotiations with Chen Family Orchard's largest customer, apparently offering to sell the farm's distribution contracts at a discount in exchange for immediate payment. The customer had called Frank to verify the legitimacy of the offer, revealing that Jessica was essentially trying to sell assets that she didn't legally own. This wasn't just unethical business practice. It was fraud on a scale that could result in serious criminal charges. More importantly, it demonstrated that Jessica had no intention of preserving the farm's operations, regardless of how the legal proceedings concluded. She was already dismantling Grandpa Bob's legacy piece by piece, confident that her legal team could protect her from any consequences. That afternoon, I called Martin Brewster and told him that I was ready to use every weapon Grandpa Bob had prepared for this battle. The time for half measures and family diplomacy had passed. If Jessica wanted to destroy everything our grandfather had built, she would have to face the full consequences of her own criminal behavior. Martin scheduled an emergency meeting with David Weaver to plan our counterattack, warning me that once we revealed Grandpa Bob's evidence, there would be no possibility of reconciliation or compromise. The upcoming trial would determine not just who inherited the farm, but whether Jessica would face criminal prosecution for theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. As I prepared for what would surely be the final phase of our legal battle, I felt a mixture of determination and sadness that had become familiar over the past months. I was determined to honor Grandpa Bob's memory by preserving the farm and its values, but sad that doing so would require destroying what remained of my relationship with Jessica and exposing her crimes to public scrutiny. The secret clause that Grandpa Bob had built into his will was about to be revealed, and when it was, Jessica's confident smirk would disappear forever. The trial began on a crisp October morning with the kind of autumn sunshine that made the maple trees around the Riverside County Courthouse glow like torches. I arrived early with David Weaver and Martin Brewster, carrying 3 banker's boxes filled with Grandpa Bob's secret documentation that would either vindicate me completely or destroy what remained of my family forever. The weight of those boxes felt heavier than their actual contents, loaded as they were with evidence of betrayal that went deeper than I had ever imagined possible. Judge Patricia Kellerman entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who had presided over countless family disputes and understood that beneath the legal arguments lay broken relationships that would never heal, regardless of her ruling. She was a woman in her early 60s, with graying auburn hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every expression and gesture in her courtroom. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for theatrical performances and legal gamesmanship. Victoria Hammond made her opening statement with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case of this magnitude, painting Jessica as a devoted granddaughter whose only crime was loving her grandfather enough to challenge a will that would destroy his life's work. According to Hammond's narrative, I was a manipulative outsider who had convinced an elderly man to reject his own family in favor of environmental theories that would bankrupt the farm within years. Hammond's presentation was flawless, weaving together financial projections, expert opinions, and emotional appeals into a story that made Jessica's challenge seem not just reasonable but morally necessary. She described the farm as a treasured community institution that employed dozens of local workers and contributed significantly to the regional economy, all of which would be jeopardized if I were allowed to implement my impractical sustainable farming fantasies. The first day of testimony proceeded exactly as I had expected, with Hammond methodically building her case through witnesses who painted me as unqualified and Jessica as responsible. Dr. Marcus Thompson returned to testify about the economic dangers of organic farming, while Mark Williams described the sound business opportunities that had been rejected due to my supposed influence over Grandpa Bob's decision-making. Jessica herself delivered another masterful performance, this time under oath and subject to cross-examination. She testified about her lifelong dedication to the farm's success and her growing concern about Grandpa Bob's increasing reliance on my advice in his final years. Her tears seemed genuine as she described feeling shut out of important family decisions and watching helplessly as her grandfather became isolated from longtime friends and business associates. During cross-examination, David Weaver attempted to challenge Jessica's version of events, but she was well prepared for his questions and gave responses that seemed reasonable and heartfelt. When Weaver asked about her plans for the farm's future, Jessica spoke eloquently about balancing tradition with necessary modernization, carefully avoiding any mention of development deals or asset sales. The second day brought more of the same, with Hammond's expert witnesses testifying about my lack of business experience and the financial risks associated with sustainable agriculture. The cumulative effect was devastating, creating an impression that I was indeed an impractical idealist who had somehow convinced my grandfather to entrust his legacy to someone fundamentally unqualified to preserve it. By the afternoon of the second day, I could see doubt creeping into Judge Kellerman's expressions as she listened to testimony about my supposed manipulation of Grandpa Bob and my unrealistic plans for the farm's future. The weight of evidence against me seemed overwhelming, and I found myself wondering whether Martin Brewster's confidence in our secret documentation was misplaced. That evening, as we prepared for the third day of testimony, Martin reviewed our strategy one final time. We would begin by calling character witnesses who could testify about my genuine relationship with Grandpa Bob and my practical knowledge of sustainable farming. Then we would present the financial records that documented Jessica's theft from the farm's accounts, followed by the audio recordings that revealed her true plans for the property. The climax would come when Martin read the secret clause that Grandpa Bob had built into his will, a provision that had been sealed pending the outcome of any legal challenge. The clause not only addressed Jessica's criminal behavior, but also contained instructions for exposing a conspiracy that went far beyond simple inheritance disputes. The third day began with my testimony, carefully structured to present my relationship with Grandpa Bob as genuine, and my plans for the farm as practical rather than idealistic. David Weaver guided me through detailed explanations of sustainable farming techniques and their economic benefits, allowing me to demonstrate knowledge that Hammond's expert witnesses had claimed I lacked. I testified about specific conversations with Grandpa Bob, where he had expressed interest in environmental stewardship not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity for the farm's long-term survival. I described his concerns about soil depletion, water conservation, and the economic risks associated with chemical-intensive farming methods that were becoming increasingly expensive and environmentally problematic. Hammond's cross-examination was brutal, but less effective than she had expected. My months of preparation had given me confidence in my knowledge of agricultural science and business principles, and I was able to provide specific answers to her challenges about implementation costs and expected returns. When she pressed me about my lack of business experience, I pointed out that Grandpa Bob had surrounded me with experienced advisors and had established management structures that would provide support during any transition period. The turning point came when David Weaver called Frank Morrison as a witness. Frank's 30 years of experience in agricultural management gave his testimony a credibility that even Hammond couldn't challenge. He described Grandpa Bob's increasing interest in sustainable practices and his explicit instructions about maintaining the farm's environmental commitments regardless of short-term financial pressures. More importantly, Frank testified about Jessica and Mark's unauthorized activities during the legal proceedings, including their attempts to negotiate sales of farm assets and their meetings with developers interested in purchasing portions of the property. His testimony established that Jessica's claims about preserving the farm were contradicted by her actual behavior when she thought no one was watching. Hammond's objections to Frank's testimony were overruled, and Judge Kellerman's expression began to shift as she realized that there might be more to this case than a simple inheritance dispute. Frank's calm, detailed responses to Hammond's aggressive cross-examination created cracks in the narrative that Jessica had so carefully constructed. The afternoon brought our first major revelation when Martin Brewster presented the financial records that documented Jessica's systematic theft from the farm's accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, showing a pattern of unauthorized loans, inflated invoices, and diverted payments that had drained nearly $400,000 from the operation over 3 years. Hammond objected strenuously to the admission of these records, arguing that they were irrelevant to the question of the will's validity and potentially prejudicial to her client. But Judge Kellerman allowed the evidence after Martin explained that it was directly relevant to understanding the motivations behind Jessica's challenge and the true financial condition of the farm that I would be inheriting. Jessica's reaction to the financial evidence was the first crack in her composed facade. Her face flushed as Martin methodically walked through bank records and canceled checks that documented her theft, and she began whispering frantically with Hammond during breaks in testimony. For the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely frightened rather than confidently indignant. Mark's response was even more telling. When he realized that their financial crimes were being exposed in open court, he tried to leave the courtroom but was stopped by a bailiff acting on Judge Kellerman's instructions. His obvious panic confirmed that the evidence was not only accurate, but potentially criminal in scope. The most devastating moment came when Martin played the audio recordings that Grandpa Bob had secretly made of Jessica's conversations about her plans for the farm. The courtroom fell silent as Jessica's voice filled the space, clearly describing the orchard as a waste of valuable real estate and outlining her strategy for converting the property to more profitable uses. In one particularly damning recording, Jessica could be heard laughing about Grandpa Bob's sentimental attachment to sustainable farming, describing his environmental concerns as the confused ramblings of an old man who had lost touch with modern business realities. Her casual cruelty towards someone she claimed to love was shocking even to observers who had followed the case closely. Another recording captured Jessica discussing her timeline for liquidating the farm's assets once she gained control, including detailed plans for selling equipment, terminating employee contracts, and breaking distribution agreements that had taken Grandpa Bob decades to establish. Her voice was cold and calculating as she described dismantling everything he had built, caring only about maximizing short-term profits. Hammond's attempts to have the recordings excluded were unsuccessful, as Martin had carefully documented their authenticity and chain of custody. Judge Kellerman listened to each recording with increasing dismay, clearly recognizing that Jessica's courtroom performance had been a complete fabrication, designed to conceal her true motivations and plans. The final recording was the most damaging, capturing a conversation between Jessica and Mark, where they discussed their strategy for challenging the will while simultaneously negotiating with potential buyers. Jessica could be heard expressing confidence that even if they lost in court, the legal fees and emotional pressure would force me to accept a settlement that would give them significant control over the farm's future. As the last recording ended, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Jessica sat frozen in her chair, apparently unable to believe that her own words were being used against her. Mark had gone pale and was staring at the floor, clearly understanding that they had been caught in a conspiracy that went far beyond inheritance disputes. Judge Kellerman called for a brief recess, during which Jessica and Mark huddled with Hammond and her associates in urgent consultation. I could see Hammond's frustration as she realized that her clients had lied to her about the extent of their activities and the evidence that might exist against them. When court resumed, Martin announced that he was prepared to present the final piece of evidence that would resolve all questions about Grandpa Bob's intentions and Jessica's motivations. He approached the bench carrying a sealed envelope that Judge Kellerman examined carefully before authorizing him to proceed. Martin explained that Grandpa Bob had included a secret clause in his will that would only be revealed if his decisions were challenged in court. The clause was designed to address exactly the kind of conspiracy that had been exposed through the financial records and audio recordings, providing both explanation and consequences for Jessica's betrayal. As Martin began reading the secret clause, Jessica stood up abruptly and demanded to be heard. Judge Kellerman ordered her to remain seated while the will was read completely, but Jessica's obvious panic suggested that she understood what was coming next. The secret clause began with Grandpa Bob's explanation of why he had secretly documented Jessica's activities over the past several years. He had become increasingly concerned about her true motivations for involvement with the farm, particularly after discovering financial irregularities that suggested theft and unauthorized borrowing. The clause detailed Grandpa Bob's decision to allow Jessica's schemes to continue while gathering evidence, creating a complete record of her criminal behavior that could be used to protect the farm from her plans. He had worked with investigators and attorneys to ensure that his evidence would be legally admissible and sufficient to support criminal prosecution if necessary. Most importantly, the clause contained specific instructions for what would happen if Jessica challenged the will. All money that she had stolen from the farm would be deducted from any inheritance she might otherwise receive, effectively reducing her bequest to zero. Additionally, the clause authorized the immediate referral of evidence about her crimes to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution. The clause also revealed that Grandpa Bob had been working with federal investigators who were examining Jessica and Mark's real estate development business for possible fraud and money laundering. The farm's stolen funds had apparently been used to support projects that involved questionable financing and environmental violations, creating federal crimes that carried severe penalties. As Martin continued reading, Jessica's composure completely collapsed. She began sobbing loudly and protesting that the recordings had been taken without her consent, that she had never intended to hurt anyone, and that she had been trying to save the farm from my environmental extremism. Judge Kellerman called for order, but the courtroom had erupted in shocked murmurs as spectators realized the full scope of what had been revealed. Local reporters were frantically taking notes, understanding that this case had become much bigger than a simple inheritance dispute. The secret clause concluded with Grandpa Bob's final message to Jessica, expressing his disappointment that someone he had loved and trusted had chosen greed over family loyalty. He wrote that he had hoped until the very end that she would abandon her schemes and embrace the values that had made the farm successful, but her decision to challenge the will proved that she was beyond redemption. When Martin finished reading, Judge Kellerman announced that she was prepared to rule immediately on the will contest, while referring the evidence of criminal activity to appropriate authorities. She stated that the financial records and audio recordings provided overwhelming proof that Jessica's challenge was motivated by criminal intent rather than legitimate concerns about Grandpa Bob's mental capacity or my qualifications. Judge Kellerman's ruling was swift and unambiguous. She found that Grandpa Bob had been of sound mind when he executed his will, and that his decisions reflected careful consideration of each family member's character and qualifications. She noted that the evidence revealed Jessica to be exactly the kind of person who should not be entrusted with preserving a family legacy. The will was upheld in its entirety, with all assets passing to me as Grandpa Bob had intended. Judge Kellerman also ordered Jessica to repay the money she had stolen from the farm's accounts, with interest and penalties that would likely exceed $500,000. Most dramatically, Judge Kellerman ordered the immediate detention of Jessica and Mark pending investigation of the criminal charges that had been exposed during the trial. As bailiffs approached their table, Jessica turned to me with a look of pure hatred and screamed that I had destroyed our family over money that I didn't deserve. Her final words before being led away were the ones that would stay with me forever. "You think you've won, but you'll get nothing but trouble from this inheritance. The farm will fail, and you'll lose everything just like I said you would." But as I watched her being escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt only sadness for what she had chosen to become. Grandpa Bob had given her every opportunity to earn his respect and trust, but she had chosen a path that led inevitably to this moment of public humiliation and criminal prosecution. In the months that followed, Jessica and Mark were convicted of multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Jessica received a 5-year prison sentence while Mark faced additional federal charges related to their real estate business. The money they had stolen was recovered and returned to the farm's accounts, providing the capital needed for the sustainable improvements that Grandpa Bob had envisioned. I moved into the farmhouse and began implementing the environmental practices that would honor his memory while ensuring the farm's long-term viability. With Frank Morrison's help and support from agricultural extension programs, we successfully transitioned to organic certification and developed new markets for premium produce that appreciated our commitment to sustainability. The farm not only survived, but thrived under the new management approach, generating higher profits while employing more workers and contributing more significantly to the local economy than it ever had under traditional methods. The success vindicated both Grandpa Bob's faith in my abilities and his belief that sustainable agriculture represented the future of farming. Most importantly, the legal battle had revealed the true character of everyone involved, separating those who valued integrity and long-term thinking from those who were motivated only by immediate gratification and personal gain. Grandpa Bob's secret clause had accomplished exactly what he intended, protecting his legacy while exposing the corruption that threatened to destroy it. Years later, as I walked through the same orchards where Grandpa Bob had taught me to recognize the signs of healthy soil and thriving trees, I understood that his greatest gift had not been the farm itself, but the wisdom to see beyond surface appearances to the deeper truths that govern human relationships. He had prepared me not just to inherit his property, but to carry forward the values that had made it worth preserving. The secret clause in his will had been more than a legal document. It was a final lesson about the importance of planning for challenges, documenting truth, and never underestimating the power of patient preparation when facing those who would choose destruction over creation. Walking out of that courthouse on the day Jessica was led away in handcuffs, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different world than the one I had inhabited for the past 18 months. The weight of uncertainty that had pressed down on my shoulders since Grandpa Bob's death suddenly lifted, replaced by an entirely new kind of pressure that came with actually inheriting a multi-million-dollar agricultural operation during one of the most challenging periods in modern farming history. The first few weeks after the trial were a whirlwind of media attention that I had never anticipated. The story of Jessica's elaborate scheme and dramatic courtroom downfall captured the imagination of local and regional news outlets, who portrayed it as a cautionary tale about family greed and the importance of preserving agricultural traditions. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews about my plans for the farm and my reaction to discovering the extent of Jessica's betrayal. The attention was overwhelming and often uncomfortable, particularly when journalists wanted to focus on the salacious details of Jessica's crimes, rather than the more complex questions about sustainable agriculture and family legacy that I considered more important. I learned to decline most interview requests, speaking publicly only when I could control the narrative and focus attention on the positive changes we were implementing at Chen Family Orchards. Frank Morrison became my closest advisor during this transition period, helping me navigate the practical challenges of taking control of an operation that had been in legal limbo for over a year. Many of the farm's longtime employees had left during the uncertainty, and we needed to rebuild our workforce, while also implementing the sustainable practices that Grandpa Bob had envisioned but never had the opportunity to fully develop. The financial recovery was more complicated than I had expected. While the court had ordered Jessica to repay the money she had stolen, actually collecting those funds required additional legal proceedings, as her assets were tied up in the criminal case and bankruptcy proceedings related to her failed real estate ventures. We eventually recovered about 60% of the stolen money, which provided enough capital to begin the transition to organic certification, but required careful budgeting and strategic planning. The first major decision I faced was whether to pursue organic certification immediately or gradually transition the farm's practices over several years. Frank advocated for the gradual approach, arguing that we needed to stabilize operations and rebuild our customer relationships before undertaking the expensive and time-consuming certification process. But I felt that Grandpa Bob would have wanted us to move boldly towards sustainability, even if it meant accepting short-term financial challenges. We decided on a hybrid approach that allowed us to begin organic practices on portions of the farm, while maintaining conventional methods on other sections until we could afford full conversion. This strategy let us learn from our experiences and adjust our techniques while generating enough revenue to support the transition costs and employee training programs that sustainable agriculture required. The learning curve was steeper than I had anticipated, despite my environmental science background and the agricultural knowledge I had gained from working alongside Grandpa Bob. Managing the business aspects of farming required skills that couldn't be learned from textbooks or university courses, and I found myself making mistakes that cost money and sometimes damaged crop yields. One particularly expensive lesson came during my first spring as the farm's owner, when I authorized the planting of an heirloom apple variety that I thought would appeal to premium markets interested in rare and unusual fruits. The variety turned out to be extremely susceptible to a fungal disease that spread to other trees before we could contain it, resulting in significant losses and expensive treatment programs that consumed most of our contingency budget. Frank was patient with my mistakes, understanding that learning to manage a complex agricultural operation required hands-on experience that couldn't be rushed or shortcut. He helped me develop systems for making decisions collaboratively, drawing on his practical knowledge while incorporating my environmental expertise and long-term vision for the farm's development. The most rewarding aspect of those early months was reconnecting with the land itself and rediscovering the joy that had first drawn me to agriculture during my childhood summers with Grandpa Bob. Walking through the orchards in the early morning, watching the sunrise illuminate rows of apple and peach trees that he had planted decades earlier, I felt a deep sense of continuity and purpose that made all the challenges worthwhile. We implemented soil testing programs that revealed the long-term damage caused by years of chemical-intensive farming, confirming Grandpa Bob's concerns about the unsustainability of conventional methods. The tests showed depleted organic matter, compromised microbial communities, and chemical residues that would take years to neutralize through organic practices. But the same tests also revealed the underlying health of the land that Grandpa Bob had carefully preserved through his choice of farming locations and his instinctive understanding of soil management. The farm's foundation was solid, requiring restoration rather than complete rehabilitation, which made our transition to sustainable practices both feasible and economically viable. As we began implementing cover cropping, composting, and integrated pest management programs, I started to understand the wisdom behind Grandpa Bob's decision to leave me the farm, despite my lack of business experience. The environmental challenges facing modern agriculture required someone who understood ecological systems and could think in terms of long-term sustainability rather than quarterly profit reports. The transition attracted attention from agricultural extension programs and university researchers who were interested in documenting our progress and sharing our experiences with other farmers considering similar changes. We became a demonstration site for sustainable practices, hosting educational tours and workshops that generated additional revenue while advancing the broader adoption of environmentally responsible farming methods. These educational programs also helped address some of the skepticism that remained in the local farming community about our new approaches. Many longtime farmers had been influenced by Jessica's claims that environmental practices would bankrupt the operation, and they were curious to see whether sustainable methods could actually maintain profitability while protecting soil and water resources. The first harvest under my management was both terrifying and exhilarating. We had invested heavily in organic certification processes and premium marketing programs, betting that consumers would pay higher prices for fruit that was produced using environmentally responsible methods. The financial success of the harvest would determine whether our approach was economically viable or just an expensive experiment. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Our certified organic apples and peaches commanded prices that were 30 to 40% higher than conventional fruit, more than compensating for the slightly lower yields that resulted from avoiding synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. Customer demand was so strong that we sold our entire harvest before the end of the season, with waiting lists for the following year. More importantly, the quality of our fruit was noticeably superior to what we had produced using conventional methods. The soil improvements and pest management programs had resulted in healthier trees that produced fruit with better flavor, longer storage life, and higher nutritional content. Customers could taste the difference, and word-of-mouth recommendations drove demand even higher. The success attracted the attention of regional grocery chains and upscale restaurants that were looking for local suppliers of premium organic produce. We negotiated contracts that provided guaranteed markets for our products, while allowing us to maintain our commitment to sustainable practices and fair labor standards. By the end of my second year as the farm's owner, we had not only recovered financially from Jessica's theft, but had achieved profitability levels that exceeded what the operation had generated under conventional management. The combination of premium pricing, efficient production methods, and diversified revenue streams from educational programs had created a business model that was both environmentally responsible and economically successful. The transformation was noticed by agricultural organizations and environmental groups that began featuring Chen family orchards as an example of how sustainable practices could enhance, rather than compromise, farm profitability. We received awards from the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association and the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, recognition that helped establish our reputation as leaders in the sustainable agriculture movement. But the most meaningful recognition came from the local farming community, where initial skepticism gradually gave way to curiosity and eventually to respect for what we had accomplished. Neighboring farmers began asking questions about our methods and requesting technical assistance with their own transitions to more sustainable practices. Frank Morrison played a crucial role in these relationships, using his credibility within the farming community to advocate for sustainable methods and share practical information about implementation challenges and solutions. His willingness to acknowledge that our approaches were working helped overcome the resistance that often greets new ideas in traditional agricultural communities. The personal satisfaction of preserving and enhancing Grandpa Bob's legacy was accompanied by the knowledge that we were contributing to broader changes in agricultural practices that would benefit future generations. The farm became a model for how family operations could adapt to environmental challenges while maintaining their economic viability and community connections. 3 years after the trial, I received an unexpected letter from Jessica, written from the minimum security prison where she was serving her sentence. The letter was both an apology and an attempt at explanation, acknowledging her crimes while trying to justify her actions as misguided efforts to secure financial security for her family. Jessica wrote that she had initially convinced herself that modernizing the farm and maximizing its short-term value was the responsible thing to do, particularly given the financial challenges facing small agricultural operations throughout the region. She claimed that her theft had been intended as temporary borrowing that she planned to repay once her real estate investments generated sufficient returns. The letter revealed a level of self-awareness that had been completely absent during her courtroom performance, suggesting that prison had given her time to reflect on the choices that had led to her downfall. She acknowledged that her resentment about my close relationship with Grandpa Bob had clouded her judgment and made her susceptible to Mark's increasingly aggressive schemes. Most surprisingly, Jessica expressed genuine admiration for what we had accomplished with the farm, writing that news reports about our sustainable practices and financial success had convinced her that Grandpa Bob's decision to leave me the inheritance had been correct. She admitted that she would never have had the patience or vision necessary to implement the long-term changes that had made the operation more successful than it had ever been. The letter concluded with a request that I consider visiting her before her release, not to seek forgiveness, but to discuss the possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship that might allow her to contribute positively to the family legacy that she had tried to destroy. She wrote that prison had taught her the value of things that couldn't be bought or sold, and that she hoped to find a way to honor Grandpa Bob's memory through constructive actions rather than destructive schemes. I struggled with how to respond to Jessica's letter, torn between my lingering anger about her betrayal and my recognition that holding grudges served no useful purpose for anyone involved. After discussing the situation with Frank and other trusted advisors, I decided to write back with cautious openness to the possibility of reconciliation, while making clear that any future relationship would depend on her demonstrating genuine change through her actions rather than just her words. My letter acknowledged her apology while explaining that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly and carefully, with concrete evidence that she had truly learned from her mistakes. I described the farm's success as validation of Grandpa Bob's wisdom rather than my own abilities, emphasizing that our achievements had been possible only because we had remained faithful to his values and vision. I also shared some of the challenges we had faced during the transition to sustainable practices, hoping that Jessica might understand that success had required patience, hard work, and commitment to principles that sometimes conflicted with short-term financial interests. The quick profits that she had sought through development deals and asset sales would never have generated the lasting prosperity that came from building something meaningful and sustainable. The correspondence continued sporadically over the following months, with Jessica gradually revealing more about the pressures and motivations that had led to her criminal behavior. She described feeling trapped between Mark's increasingly desperate financial schemes and her own recognition that their real estate business was built on questionable practices that were bound to collapse eventually. Jessica also acknowledged that her resentment about my inheritance had been rooted in deeper insecurities about her own worth and abilities, particularly her fear that her business-focused approach to agriculture was less valuable than my environmental expertise. She admitted that rather than trying to learn from my knowledge, she had chosen to dismiss it as impractical, because accepting its validity would have required admitting her own limitations. When Jessica was released from prison after serving 4 years of her sentence, she returned to Ohio to find that the agricultural community had been transformed by the sustainable practices that were spreading throughout the region. Chen Family Orchards had become a demonstration site for methods that were being adopted by dozens of other farms, creating a network of environmentally responsible operations that supported each other through shared knowledge and cooperative marketing programs. Jessica's first visit to the farm was awkward but not hostile, marked by her obvious amazement at the changes that had been implemented during her absence. The soil improvements, biodiversity enhancements, and infrastructure upgrades had transformed the property into something that looked more like a carefully designed ecological system than a traditional agricultural operation. She spent several hours walking through the orchards with Frank and me, asking detailed questions about our methods, and expressing genuine interest in understanding how we had achieved such dramatic improvements in both environmental and economic performance. Her questions were informed and thoughtful, suggesting that she had spent considerable time during her incarceration studying sustainable agriculture and trying to understand what she had dismissed so carelessly years earlier. The conversation was careful and formal, but it established a foundation for what might eventually become a renewed relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Jessica acknowledged that she had no claims on the farm's operations or profits, expressing instead a desire to contribute somehow to the positive work that was being done in Grandpa Bob's name. Over the following months, Jessica began volunteering with educational programs at the farm, helping to coordinate tours and workshops for other farmers who were interested in transitioning to sustainable practices. Her business background proved valuable for developing marketing materials and organizing events, while her personal story served as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The transformation was gradual but genuine, marked by Jessica's growing understanding of the principles that had guided Grandpa Bob's vision for the farm and my own commitment to environmental stewardship. She began to see that the wealth created by sustainable practices was more durable and meaningful than the quick profits she had once pursued through development schemes and financial manipulation. More importantly, Jessica developed relationships with the farm workers and community members who had been affected by her crimes, taking concrete steps to make amends for the damage she had caused. She volunteered with local charities, participated in environmental restoration projects, and used her business skills to help other ex-offenders find employment and rebuild their lives. The process of reconciliation was neither quick nor easy, requiring years of patient effort from everyone involved, but it demonstrated that even the most serious betrayals could potentially be healed through genuine repentance, consistent positive actions, and a shared commitment to principles larger than individual interests. Today, Chen Family Orchards continues to thrive as both a successful agricultural operation and a model for sustainable farming practices that are being adopted throughout Ohio and neighboring states. The farm employs over 40 people, generates annual revenues that exceed $3 million, and serves as a research site for university programs studying the economic and environmental benefits of organic agriculture. Jessica now manages the farm's educational programs, using her experience and hard-won wisdom to help other farmers navigate the challenges of transitioning to sustainable practices while maintaining their economic viability. Her transformation from someone who tried to destroy Grandpa Bob's legacy to someone who actively promotes its values represents the kind of redemption that he would have hoped for but probably never expected to see. The secret clause in Grandpa Bob's will had accomplished far more than simply protecting the farm from Jessica's schemes. It had created the conditions for a deeper understanding of what true wealth really means, and how genuine prosperity can only be built on foundations of integrity, environmental responsibility, and commitment to values that transcend individual gain. Standing in the same orchard where Grandpa Bob had taught me to recognize the signs of healthy soil and thriving trees, I often reflect on the journey that brought us to this point. The legal battle that seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately become the catalyst for transformations that none of us could have imagined when we first gathered in Martin Brewster's office to hear the reading of the will. The farm now represents everything that Grandpa Bob had hoped it could become: a profitable business that provides good jobs for local workers, a model for environmentally responsible agriculture that contributes to the health of the surrounding ecosystem, and a lasting legacy that honors the values of hard work, integrity, and stewardship that he had spent his lifetime developing. Most importantly, it serves as a reminder that true wealth cannot be stolen or manipulated away from those who understand its source and are willing to work to preserve it. Jessica had been wrong when she predicted that I would get nothing from my inheritance except trouble and failure. What I got instead was the opportunity to build something meaningful that will continue to benefit future generations long after all of us are gone. The secret clause had revealed not just Jessica's crimes, but also the deeper truth that Grandpa Bob had understood from the beginning. That the real value of any legacy lies not in what it can be sold for today, but in what it can become when nurtured by people who share the vision and values of those who created it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.